One of the many pleasures of being in the RPG hobby right now is the proximity we still have to the very beginnings of the hobby. Even for those of us who are too young to have been game players in 1974, that date and the decade after it are not so far away. Not only is it possible to imagine what it might have been like to be among the very first D&D players, but it's still very possible to actually own original D&D materials. Even if you are not a serious collector, like the author of this book is, even the casual eBay user can manage to acquire some original gaming paraphernalia, whether it's an old D10, the kind that required pen and ink to fill in the numbers, or an old outdoor survival game board, hand-marked by a long-ago user, most likely a player from the 70s. These artifacts are accessible to us. In this book, which is a love letter to the hobby by a collector and somebody who is incredibly knowledgeable about the history of the hobby, is as it says here, a compendium. It's a deep dungeon crawl and a personal journey through the history, evolution, and culture of tabletop RPGs. Absolutely wonderful and an essential addition to any gaming library. Yes, that's a blurb on the back of the book, but it is also true about what this book is. The author chronicles how RPGs have evolved in time between their inception and the present day, offering a deep and gratifying glimpse into a hobby that has changed the way we think about games and play. This is the latest addition to a growing number of books that document the history of RPGs. The author has mined from his collection of over 2,500 RPG publications a visual and analytical tour of the hobby. And we're going to look through, as I talk about this book, we'll flip through the book, starting here with the credits, the original photographs by the author and original illustrations by Kyle Patterson. And it is as the subtitle of the book claims, it is a guide to tabletop role-playing games from D&D to Mothership. It's organized chronologically. And it goes a little bit beyond Mothership for a couple of games that were released in 2020. Mothership originally came out in 2018. Outside, the book looks like a coffee table book. It is very big. It's oversized. It's a 4-color book throughout, and it's printed on glossy paper, as you can see here. As I page through, I'm going to try to linger a little bit on the spreads that divide the decades, because they each have a little few sentences about the decade that sort of sums things up nicely. I won't read all of them, but this one, the 70s, says, in which RPGs are born from the embers of war games, identity struggles ensue as game designers stake out the new frontier. Players confront funhouses, starships, and chaotic caves armed with dice, random tables, and innovative mechanics. And each of the part openers is a double spread like this with a little summary of what is to come. The book is described by the publishers as a, quote, richly illustrated encyclopedic deep dive into the history of role-playing games. It does benefit from the extensive knowledge of the author, not only from his collection and all the materials in this book, the images and are from his collection, and what he writes about is from his knowledge. And I'll say, as you can see here, the balance between text and imagery, the author says it's 180,000 words in the manuscript of the book, which is a very long book. It is not really an art book, as art books go, in terms of the balance between the text and the imagery. Even if the book were printed without any illustrations at all, it would provide a comprehensive and really useful history of the development of RPGs. So, as I said, the entries are chronologically ordered, and the chronology of the decades kind of does work to organize the development. It's convenient to the development of a trajectory of RPG development, and the summaries that the author provides in them is really useful, as I mentioned. The author covers a range of topics in this book, showing readers how RPGs evolved from wargame variants with an adversarial relationship between the GM and players to more collaborative storytelling. Entries on individual games are organized chronologically, but when relevant, they will reach backwards and forwards in time so the reader understands how the published backlog of games form a tapestry that is now the foundation of gaming. Almost every entry becomes a short point or like mini little article about gameplay development, as an overall theme of the book is to remind readers that this is a hobby that is ever evolving and changing and is very dynamic, and that games nowadays look back to the games of beforehand. So the 1980s, in which rapid expansion unleashes an explosion of new material, licensed intellectual property ensnares game designers, and narrative-focused adventure reigns supreme. Players delve into bustling cities and intricate worlds as lightweight rules emerge. To be sure, there is material here that's going to be all too familiar to anyone, even lightly versed in RPG history. The origins of D&D, the changes between and among the early edition, the rules of the game, the infighting among game designers. These things are all pretty well known to people who are familiar with the history of the hobby. But there's a good deal of material that's covered that's often left out of standard histories, and this discussion of Dallas is one of them. This is a game that is based on the television show of the name. It was published in 1980. And I was really happy to see the discussion here because there were some novel mechanisms in this game around social combat. And they were very interesting to me, so much so that years ago I made a video about social combat. You can see the link to it up here. And this is discussed here in the discussion of Dallas. And the author really does the game justice by talking about that and not just looking at it as a novelty like, oh, there's a RPG made from a TV show that was popular. So there are other examples of this in this book where the author's vast knowledge of role-playing mechanics and changes and innovations are really front and center. For example, he talks about Ars Magica and its troop style of play, and the first GM-less play, which was in a game called Universalis from 2002. So these pieces of information are throughout the book, really, and you can just open almost any entry and learn something new about the hobby that you might not have known. It might be something about the mechanics, it might be something about the publishing and design. Along the way, readers will learn about the differences between hex crawls and point crawls, and the games that first brought those aspects into play. We learn about mega dungeons and which game was the first to make an entire subterranean inhabited world. And of course, there's discussion of game mechanics. And there's a through line in the book tracing the move from complexity to simplicity in terms of rule sets and what that actually means for play and for narrative. Overall, I think the book does fulfill the promise it makes to deliver a compendium of artifacts as well as a personal journey through the hobby and an exhaustive, in a good way, analysis of major and minor developments in the field. The book clocks in at over 400 pages with some very useful appendices for the serious reader. These include a complete listing of the games discussed with full publication information by decade, so it's very easy to get everything you need if you want to look them up. That's really appreciated, I think, by researchers in the field or those that will have more minor games called to their attention here that they might want to investigate further. There's a listing of resources and references beyond the games that are discussed, a listing of artists of note, and what were the major game systems that they illustrated. There's some other appendices. There's a glossary of sorts that I think was a little bit brief, but I was glad to see it. And then there was also a brief discussion about dungeons themselves. Despite this wealth of information, I do find the book falls short in a couple of ways. And here we see the Ars Magica page and discussion I referenced earlier. And we'll flip ahead as long as we're here to the Let's see, the next spread. These are the 1990s. And we'll just jump ahead to look at the 2000s here, in which a unified game system brings the industry to epic heights only to reduce it to ruins. From the rubble of tumult and transition emerge retroclones, hacks, and the story game movement. So anyway, as I was saying, despite the wealth of information, I think there's a couple of areas that it falls short. And the first is the most significant and was really puzzling to me, and this has to do with the illustrations. That, as you can see, all of the photographs are the front covers of rule sets. Maybe there's one or two back covers of books. But there's no interior shots. There are no spreads of the games being discussed inside. There's none of the mapping of the amazing dungeons that are talked about, or the amazing design advances of the past few years, and basically no visual representation at all of the interior of anything. And that, I think, is a significant omission in this book, and I don't really understand it. I was trying to figure out why. So I thought, well, maybe the publisher or the author was worried that an interior shot was permissive in a way that exterior shots are not. But honestly, if that's the case, then MIT Press should have just paid for permission to have at least some interiors, because there is some discussion specifically made about some key dungeons, for example, or key layouts and things that really are significant to the history of the game. And to not see them, even though the author describes them, is a real loss. We'll take a pause here. The 2010s, in which RPGs experience a renaissance. D&D captures mainstream audiences, while the zine scene inspires beautiful experiments that captivate a new ground. Previously unimagined horizons foretell the dawn of a new golden age. So that was confusing to me. And then I thought, well, maybe the author himself, who's credited with taking these photos, wasn't comfortable taking the type of photo that you would need to do to take an interior shot, in which case, again, somebody else should have been hired to do it. I don't know. It's confusing. And then whatever the reason, I don't understand why there wasn't an author's note explaining the omission, because there is a good deal of discussion very early on in the book that gives you information about the author and how he approached this work. And I've looked over that twice, and I don't see any mention of the decision not to have any interior shots. So that to me was a pretty big lack, just from a conceptual point as well as just an informational point, because seeing the insides of some of these games and rule sets would offer just so much information. My second bone of contention with the book is less perhaps important to general readers, although for obvious reasons it's important to me, which is that early on in the book, on page 9, in fact, the author writes that in recent years, interest in solo RPGs has grown and developed into various new forms. And while the book does include at least one journaling RPG, which was The Quiet Year that you saw just a few pages ago, there's no discussion at all of solo RPG. Now, I understand, and the book makes very clear, this is a book that is from the perspective of the author. And while it looks like it should be encyclopedic, and while in fact it is referred to as being that way, the fact is that it is from the author's perspective. He happens to have an encyclopedic collection, but maybe he doesn't play solo RPG, so that was left out. But nevertheless, I think there should have been at least a mention of solo RPG, especially some of the very significant games that are soloable or that are co-op, such as Ironsworn and Scarlet Heroes. I think those are the two most obvious ones that are omitted in this book and really should be there, because it's a significant development in the hobby. So overall, this is a book that's the other thing about it. I'm not sure who this is a book for, and just not to harp on this, but Fungi of the Far Realms, I have this book. It is an amazing, incredible book that's presented as like a naturalist's guide to mushrooms, except all the mushrooms are made up. Seeing the inside of this book is would offer so much. Seeing the outside of it, I mean, it's a cool piece of art. It doesn't really offer very much. So again, super confused about that decision. Anyway, getting back to the audience for this book, I'm just not sure who the book is written for. If you are a historian of the hobby, you would certainly want it on your shelf. But I don't know who else is the intended reader, because I'm not sure that most game players are that interested in reading 180,000 words about the history of the hobby. And it's not really an art book, because while it's showing you the outsides of things, it's mostly a textbook. And in terms of, well, text book, most of the pages are text. And as mentioned, there's not a comprehensive interior. So we look at some of the appendices. So I'm a little unclear on the audience, which doesn't say anything negative about the book per se, but I do wonder what the thought process was behind that at MIT Press in terms of who they think it's for. As I said earlier, I think the book would work very effectively as a history of RPGs, even without the photos, because the content is that it's that authoritative. And while some of the material early on, I think, is often repeated, there's a lot of new material in there that I personally learned from and did not know about. And then the last thing I'd say is if I was publishing the book, I'd have made sure that the word dungeons was in the title, because I feel that the dungeon is the iconic image associated with RPGs. It's the iconic word associated with it. And the omission is curious to me and makes me kind of want to know the story behind the decision to leave the word dungeons out in favor of this more generic holes in the ground.